including the presentation. Okay, we're beginning the recording. Just say in the chat if you don't wish to be part of that recording. So, as I say, welcome to everybody. My name's Stephen Oram. I'm convening the panel. I'm also contributing to it. So I'll do more formal introductions a bit later on, but we also have Sarah Dillon and Ben Greenaway as the three of us on the panel. Sadly, Will Slocum, who was the fourth member, is unable to make it. So it's the three of us, but it's still going to be very, very good. And also it gives you as the other participants a bigger share of the airspace, shall we say. So we're going to do this in a kind of structured way to start off with. So I'll do a bit more of an introduction in a couple of minutes to what the panel's about, and then we'll have presentation from Sarah, and then a presentation from Ben, then a presentation from me, and then we'll move into a kind of discussion between the three of us. But please, and after that, we'll move into a sort of audience Q&A, so a very sort of standard format. However, please feel free to drop questions into the chat whenever you want. Once we're through the presentations, we'll be looking at those, and we may pick up some of those as we go along, or we'll save some until the end. I think what would really, really help me if the chat gets busy is if you put a Q or something at the beginning, or question, so that scanning up and down, I can kind of see what's a question as opposed to what's a sort of side conversation that's going on. And when we get into the Q&A, you don't have to put it in the chat, because you can put your hands up and we can invite you in, and we'll do that. So that's kind of the broad structure to the panel. So just to introduce it, hopefully you'll kind of know what it's about anyhow by reading the title and signing up. But just to remind you, the title was, or is, Speculative Fiction in Relation to Prediction, Innovation and Futures, and the Applied Role it can play in the social and technological transformations of AI and in shaping future history. So quite a big and broad title, to say the least. We then went on to say, acknowledging the messiness and uncertainty of futurity, I can't say that word, and the rich aesthetic reality of speculative fiction, the panel will discuss what applied role speculative fiction, such as science fiction, can play in the social and technological transformations of AI and in shaping a future history. And when I was thinking about this panel and sort of convening it and thinking who to have on it and all the rest of it and what it should be about, I've kind of come at this from, so I'm guest editing an issue of Vector, which is the British Science Fiction Association's critical journal, around this topic. And the thing that had prompted me to want to hover over this topic was, so I'm a near future fiction author. In that role, did I have a responsibility around what I wrote to both today and the future? And there's a number of layers to that question, which I'll kind of touch on in my piece. But that was my kind of motivation, if you like, behind this. And I think we've got, between the three of us, we've probably got three fairly different but complementary perspectives around all this. So we shall see. Learn whether or not I have a responsibility or not. So if everyone's okay, we'll move on to the actual presentation. So introducing Sarah Dillon, who is a Professor of Literature and Public Humanities at the University of Cambridge. She's a scholar of contemporary literature and film, especially science fiction. Her most recent books are Story Listening, Narrative Evidence and Public Reasoning, which was published in 2021, and makes the case for the cognitive value of stories and how they can form part of a pluralistic evidence base to inform decision making. And also co-edited the 2020 2020 collection of AI narratives, a history of imaginative thinking about intelligent machines. She has 2 articles being published in the next few weeks that might be of particular interest to this audience. One is on public criticism, it's forthcoming in Textual Practice, which makes an intervention into post-critique debates. And another, she has, presenting the results of an interview study and literature review of what AI researchers read, analysing how this reading informs their scientific thought and practice, and that's forthcoming in interdisciplinary science reviews. So that's Professor Sarah Dillon. The title of her presentation, her paper, is Story Listening, Why SF Matters for Public Reasoning About AI. So Sarah, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks Stephen. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint and then we will get going. Is that working for everybody? Brilliant. So the abstract for the talk that is on the conference website is the abstract for the paper that we'll be writing for the Vector special issue. What I'm going to present in the next 10 minutes, maybe 12, 13 minutes, is a sort of taster of some of those ideas rather than the whole thing. But Stephen's steer on the panel was very much, kind of these brief taster introductions and then lots of time for conversation and discussion. So I'm sure, as with the other people, more than happy to elaborate or go into detail on anything that I don't in the next few minutes. Also, as you could probably hear, a little bit poorly, so please excuse me if my voice gets even croakier. So the other thing I have to do as a preamble is just to acknowledge my co-author Claire Craig, who's the co-author of Story Listening, which the cover of which is on this slide. And much of what I'm going to say today and in the Vector article is drawn from our collaborative research, although she isn't here today. So the basic claim of the paper is that science fiction stories are narrative models, which, when they're subject to expert attention, can provide narrative evidence that's of use to public reasoning. And what I'll do now is just briefly present the academic basis for that claim and then offer some practical examples, specifically in the context of AI. A distinction to make at the outset is that science fiction stories can be mimetic narrative models or anticipatory narrative models, and that it's hugely important to identify in which mode a story is functioning at any moment, because the same story can function in both modes, and it depends on what its target system is taken to be, and I'll explain that term in a minute, and whether that target system is actual or hypothetical. So identifying which mode the story is functioning in means that you can then identify the best context of public reasoning that model could be used in. So for instance, a mimetic narrative model might be more useful for nearer term or narrower areas of public reasoning in which more elements of the target system are already fixed. You know more things about the world, while anticipatory narrative models might be more useful in longer term areas where more elements of the target system are unknown or uncertain at present. So the claim then is that science fiction stories function as narrative models which enable surrogative reasoning about present conditions if they're mimetic, as well as about future states and pathways to those states if they're anticipatory. And if a lot of that language sounds technical, then I'm going to hopefully explain some of it in a minute. So first of all, the academic case. In what way can we reasonably understand a story to function as a model? Well, models in general are structures that are created to indirectly present parts of the world in which the model creator or the model user is interested. And this part of the world is what's called the target system. So a model is a simpler hypothetical system that resembles in useful ways part of the real world. And some of you may know the Borges story it's translated in various ways on Plenitude in Science, where a fictional country decide to create a model of the world. And of course, they become more and more accurate. It becomes so big that the map actually covers the terrain. So it's a kind of nice little cautionary tale about models always being partial or they're not useful. And because they're partial, they're easier to study and derive results from than studying the whole of the target system. And then we can reason about the model, and then we can transfer the results of that reasoning to understanding the target system. And Chris Swoyer calls this surrogative reasoning. Now, in the book, what we do is we did a big literature review of current theories about modeling. We found Roman Frigg and James Nguyen's most recent work in essays and in a book on models. Forgive me, I haven't put the link on the slide, but I'll put it in the chat when I finish speaking. And they create a system for explaining how a scientific model relates to the world, because their argument is that this is the absolutely fundamentally important bit. If we don't have a robust theory of scientific representation, if we don't have a robust theory of how a model connects to the world, then all the other things that we say we can do with it are unsubstantiated. And I'm not going to go into it in detail, but they present the DECI model, which I put on the slide, and which you can have a read of. And if you want to get into the philosophy, we can talk about it. But you might be happy to take my word that this is a really robust and effective way of understanding how stories represent, how models represent the world. What was exciting was to discover that as I was extrapolating this to make the same case for how narrative models represent the world, James and Roman had also done that independently towards the end of the book. So both of us were at the same time thinking, yes, this gives a model of scientific representation, but actually it gives a model of narrative representation as well, which moves on discussions in literary theory about mimesis into a much more, I think, rigorous terrain about how stories represent. So our claim is that stories can be narrative models based on narrative representation according to the DECI system, and that they are therefore can be understood as idealized descriptions or conceptions of a target system through narrative means that can help perform some cognitive function with respect to that system and yield knowledge through surrogative reasoning. So that's the theory. Let me show you how this might work in practice and why this is really important to inform contemporary discussion around AI. And the first example is one you'll be all familiar with, which is the Terminator. So newspaper reports you may observe on scientific advances in machine learning and AI, its capabilities, its near-term and its far future implications are often accompanied by an image of the Terminator. We all know it's clickbait, but there's also lots of interesting things happening here that I want to talk about. The Terminator has an implied in its image story behind it of malign, implacable humanoid artificial intelligence. Now, the effect of dominant stories such as this demonstrates the power they have to influence public reasoning and decision making, and evidencing why precisely, according to Ursula K. Heiser's work, and she's thinking about sustainability and climate change, but it's a really useful quote for AI as well. She says it stands to reason that such conceptualizations, which tend to be more available to the general public than scientific information, play an important role in the selection and evaluation of risks. And a lot of my work is devoted to that. It stands to reason, to actually interrogating why and how they function in this way. The same case about the impact of such stories that Heiser is making about climate stories applies to AI stories, where dominant stories of intelligent machines like the Terminator are often mistakenly received as mimetically modeling the capabilities of the technologies rather than mimetically modeling the current socio-technical context. And this is a crucial point. So in relation to AI stories, we need to understand exactly what target system they are modeling. They might be mimetic, but they might be mimetic and representing something quite different to what you think they're representing. So the Terminator example exposes the difference between an image from a story being taken out of context of that story in order to become a metonym, and that's a rhetorical term in literary studies for something that stands, a part that stands for a whole. So in order to metonymically represent a speculative fear, so fear of the rise of machines or fear of killer robots or the end of humankind, versus what we're arguing for, which is proper attention to the mimetic qualities of the original story in order to understand the reasoning that enables. So to give you an example of that reasoning, the original film can be understood as a mimetic narrative model of contemporary fears regarding the wider systems within which new technologies are developed and deployed. And in that context, the relevance of the story is not to do with the embodied robot in a technological sense. The story models the socio-technical system in which the current, actually much less sophisticated than in the movie, technology is embedded. The Terminator then, as a narrative model, is concerned with the elements of the target system that are about the power of those controlling or developing technologies. And those forces and that power are not represented in the figure of the humanoid robot at all, but as you probably will remember, in Skynet, the conscious artificial neural network-based group mind AGI system that's the real antagonist in the film and which controls the Terminator machines. Skynet's not visually depicted in any of the original 3 films in the Terminator franchise, and its lack of physical instantiation, Skynet represents these fears of unnamed and distributed structures of human corporate and other power, reflecting a contemporary sense that various publics have that they don't have control over or influence over technology's uses or consequences, and that the values and intentions of those who do may not be aligned with their own. Skynet is also, and I don't have a picture of it, Skynet is also productively mimetic, not of a threat of AGI, but of the fact that disembodied AI systems in the form, for instance, of algorithmic decision-making or facial recognition technologies, in fact, pose much more of a threat to human life at present than do humanoid robots of any description. And public reasoning, we argue, be much more usefully informed by paying attention to the productive interpretation of other dominant AI stories as mimetic of contemporary concerns, rather than as actual imaginings of the current or future state or capacity of the technologies. To put next to the Terminator some different stories. The Terminator is an example of anthropomorphization of AI. It's seen across much Western mainstream AI narratives. Solo, a Star Wars movie, which I love, is also a strong example of this. And in that film and elsewhere in the literature, this anthropomorphization leads to what we think of as non-relevant reasoning about personhood and rights in relation to AI. We argue that this kind of attention to extensive imaginative exploration of anthropomorphized sentient AGI would be useful if we were at the point where AGI was achieved or on the horizon. But that public reasoning now shouldn't be distracted by a line of thought that is, you could argue, entirely irrelevant to the technical realities and social challenges of the increasing contemporary prevalence of automated decision-making. And this latter, as I've said, brings with it much more real and present day challenges in relation to how we interact with the machines that are increasingly governing our lives. More important then are stories that explore the consequences and the effects of this structural imbrication of the human and the machine, in particular within the context of governance and decision-making, and stories that recognize and explore the network distributed nature and effects of automated technologies. And I've put a few on the handout there that you might look at. Another is Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress from 1966, which, while still making the central supercomputer Holmes 4 a sentient character for storytelling purposes, positions the computer in relationship to and as part of systems of governance of lunar civilization, both its strict regulation and its use as part of the resistance movement. So it's a kind of fascinating narrative model, even from the mid-20th century. 3 others I've put on here, and a nod to Will, who couldn't be with us, who's written really interestingly on these texts and others in a chapter of the AI Narratives collection that Stephen mentioned at the beginning. Before I wrap up, I thought I'd just give you a different example, Asimov. So the work of Isaac Asimov is to some extent already being taken seriously in contemporary AI science and discourse. For instance, within reasoning about robots and robotics and ethics, with a number of recent resolutions and principles over the past sort of 5 to 10 years, explicitly referencing Asimov's laws. But the argument that I'm making is that such attention might be made much more sophisticated by taking into account a fuller understanding of what's actually going on in Asimov's robot stories. So we don't need to reject them because they're fictional, but we also don't need to adopt them as a blueprint. We need to realize that the stories are helpful to robot ethics in that they demonstrate the way in which programming is not fully determinant of outcome, that even computer laws produce unexpected consequences. Asimov's stories are all about how the laws go wrong, where their limits are, how they are circumvented, how they lead to these unanticipated consequences. The stories demonstrate this, yes, in a range of very entertaining, and Asimov's very funny, and I think we can forget that sometimes, entertaining but informative scenarios, which might inform contemporary reasoning about the relationship between the rules contained in coding and algorithms, and questions of control, prediction, and value alignment. What Asimov exploited for literary purposes is what's now being contended with in reality, the unpredictability of programming, in particular with regard to its real world effects. And again, to put something next to Asimov, like I did with the Terminator, I'm actually putting Asimov next to Asimov, but a different bit of Asimov's work. Public reasoning could usefully attend to science fiction stories other than the kind of ones that immediately come to mind. And here we could look, instead of Asimov's robot stories, at his Foundation trilogy, in which he interrogates the limits and effects of what we would now think of as big data and predictions based on it in systems of governance. Now, for some contemporary thinkers who are listening to Asimov's material, his theory of social prediction in the Foundation series, which he calls psychohistory, is a goal to be actualized. And the GDELT project that I've put up on that slide is one example. But if you go back to the narrative model and attend to it in detail, Asimov builds quite strict limitations into his concept of psychohistory. For instance, that it is only effective for very, very large populations, only over very, very extended periods of time, and that it necessarily and absolutely requires secrecy from the people who are being subject to it, that it requires a lack of transparency and a restriction of freedoms that might go in direct conflict with some of our democratically held values now. And paying attention to these elements of Asimov's narrative models be highly instructive in relation to contemporary public reasoning about the benefits and risks of big database decision making. So to conclude then, the same caveats around the use of scientific models to inform public reasonings that were identified in this Government Office of Science report in 2018 also apply to narrative models. And this is another sort of crucial argument of the book, that often stories are dismissed for the very same reasons, actually, that one could also dismiss scientific evidence. And there are very strong arguments about why one mustn't do that with scientific evidence and how one has to use it carefully. And those same arguments apply to narrative evidence. So the quote here from the Government Office of Science report: models can be powerfully powerful assistance in decision making, but they can also be dangerous and misleading if misused and misapplied. This is directed to computational models, but both narrative models and scientific models need to be deployed judiciously and in appropriate contexts. And so just as scientific models could be powerful assistants or dangerous and misleading, so can narrative models, which is no argument for not using them, just as it's no argument for not using scientific models, but is an argument for having rigorous structures in place for how you use them effectively and responsibly. I know that was a bit longer than 10 minutes, sorry, but thank you.
Not a problem being longer than 10 minutes there. That was fascinating. And I kind of want to start a conversation now, but I'm gonna hold. I'm gonna resist, and we'll move on. We'll move on to Ben, but we'll all be holding our questions in our head.
Very much so. Yeah, so very much so.
So here we have Ben Greenaway. I'll introduce Ben and then he'll do his presentation. So Ben is a mobile applications developer, a full stack World Wide Web engineer and educator with clients including the British Library, the Nominet Trust, OpenDemocracy.net and The Big Issue. He recently contributed to the curriculum of a suite of digital media qualifications using the European Credit Transfer System and is currently Senior Web Development Manager at The Fold London. His writing on software development and business startups has been published in Web and PHP Magazine and PHP Architect. His stories in the forthcoming Cyber Salon book, 22 Ideas About the Future, will be his first published fiction. And just to touch on Cyber Salon, is a UK-based collective and think tank focusing on the process and effect of the digital revolution in industry, society, and its emerging digital cultures. Recently developed a digital rights charter proposition for the Labour Party in 2019. So that's Cyber Salon, and that is Ben. As you can see, coming from a different angle. The title of Ben's presentation is Beyond the Plausible and Possible, Cyber Salon's use of near future fiction in their research, policy development and public engagement activities. So Ben, over to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. So the first thing I want to say really, it's also about the slides and the common thread I think that's I think you know now is about this panel, the vector piece and where we all sort of line up with the edition of Vector that Stephen is co-editing. I really do come from a different background. So this is an engineer's sort of background. It's a fit in the trenches kind of background. But straight off the bat, what I'd like to say is our use of stories. And one that didn't even occur to me because we use it so often. I've used it 3 times this morning before I even came to this event, is the user story. And for those of you who might not spend time in development or software development or product or service development at all, the user story is quite literally the thing you build before you build any other product. I'll touch on that again because it does actually inform how Cyber Salon got into what it got into. But let me just bring up some slides here. Are we all good? So the first one, as I said, this is what Stephen's sort of said already. It's like, hello, I am Ben. I am one of Cyber Salon's senior contributing members. I've been a member of the think tank now for best part of 10 years, although I did actually attend a very early Cyber Salon event before I even realized we had a Cyber Salon. But beyond the plausible and the possible, I'd like to talk a little bit about how Cyber Salon has come to use near future fiction and science fiction in its research and its public outreach events. So let's see if I'm able to change the slides. There we go. Cyber Salon, if I start there, a little bit of background. It was founded originally in the mid-90s on the back of our founder's first cyber cafes. That's Eva Pascoe, who can't be with us today, but partnership that she had with a very early innovator in this field was to set up the Siberia Cyber Cafe. So it was the first cyber cafe in the world. A chain ended up being turning into a ISP, for those of you who remember those kind of things back in the day, and grew and grew and grew. And Cyber Salon really originally was founded very much the following year or two. So this is an event at .org, sort of talking about some history of internet activism. As I say, Cyber Salon on the back of Siberia existing. Siberia, the goal there was to get everybody online. This was a time when HTML was finally doing something, when the internet was finally something that you wanted everybody to participate in. People could produce very simple pages with very simple bits of code, and we all were like, let's get in there, let's get in and populate this new space as fast as possible. And Siberia was constantly doing that kind of outreach. On the back of that, Cyber Salon was formed to sort of respond to some concerning behaviors, let's say, of some of the actors in the early web, more particularly the development of the digital cookie, the beginnings of those kind of advertising and tracking behaviors, things that, you know, whilst not explicit, the machine learning, the AI in the early days, the big data story was already starting to embed itself, and to concern and to be aware and to make the new population of cyberspace aware of these kind of issues was why Cyber Salon was born. So if you look in the list there, it's like literally around the same time as Need to Know Net. Need to Know was great online mag, if those of you who weren't in digital London in the 90s, really great thing to know. And we've been involved, as is Wendy, who's one of the contributors there on the right, still in Cyber Salon to this day. So in 1997, the Siberia Cafe and the Hypermedia Research Centre at the University of Westminster sort of joined to form Cyber Salon with its, you know, goal of addressing both participation, activism, and the concerns of digital rights as they were. Since then, we've existed twice, really, refounded again around 2010, 2012, this time with a larger audience. Audiences generally include everybody from entrepreneurs and technologists like myself, other hackers, various activists, could be government officials, businesses and community leaders, academics, artists, creatives, and designers. And our mode of operation as a think tank tends to be public events, research pieces as well that may be based in terms of workshops, but the discussion, the finding an important speaker to present and to give a discussion. Here you see us in our home for most of the noughties, which was Digitas LBS in Clink Street. Is it Clink Street? No, it wasn't Clink Street. It was somewhere else in the East End of London. With an event discussing the dark net, and in the lower image there, an event discussing the cyborg. So there's Neil Harbison joining us, and there's Rachel Armstrong there, who also was contributing to the book that we're talking about. So a variety of behaviors. Also an affiliation in 2011, so this second founding, if you like, of Cyber Salon, where we now brought Middlesex University on board and started to do the development work around more of the education pieces. So partnering with them on a digital media BA in 2018, and more recently the launch of the European vocational credit based assessment program called DigiBlocks. Again, all pieces again with the same kind of perspectives, like involve people on online activity, involve them in the increasingly growing, as it was in the noughties and the more recently, e-commerce is a field in its own right, but with that internet activism sort of blend. So a practical involvement as well as that somewhat critical involvement. I definitely don't come from the university half of the Cyber Salon team. I'm definitely entrenched in the entrepreneurs and the engineers and the builders half. But you see here Dr. Sophia Dracupula, who is at Middlesex University, she's a vendor, senior contributing editor, helps build a lot of their content. And it was actually on her invite, I think, that we ended up presenting at the Hybrid City event in Athens, again, in this second founding. And by that time, I'm no beard, but participating more fully. Projects then were starting to focus on, again, open data sets, the very large trawling. I mean, in the course of the time between the late 90s and the mid to late noughties, the cost, as you may well know, of digital storage just dropped through the floor. So where there was a huge effort needed in the early web to be efficient of content and to make sense of what goes up sparingly, storing information even more sparingly, only store what was needed to make things work. As the e-commerce push in, let's say, 2002, 2003, the second generation of online presence really started to take off, the cost of storing data just became so minuscule, so small, that it was almost not on the books. You didn't even care. So consequently, everybody started to collect and gather every piece of data, because why not? It might be interesting to find out. It might be interesting to know what happened on the website. It might be interesting to know people's behaviors. But this growing collection of data points, be they browsing behaviors, presence and location behaviors, obviously has the twin troubles of, on the one hand, if you make it public, if you make it access, if you allow people to get involved in it, then those that can and will have a new evidence base with which to form decisions and to be involved in their locales and their environments. But equally, if you're on the other end of that story, you're saying, well, I didn't know anything about data. I had no idea that I was being measured in this way. The loss of agency, the number of people that were being affected with that started to skyrocket. And this is even before we started seeing what social media could do to that. So in a reaction to that, Cyber Salon tries to do outreach on data gathering, data investigations. So partnering with the Open Data Institute, the ODI, we've done a number of those, a number of hackathons in and around London. And as I said, this one out in Athens where we ran some workshops. How easy is it to gather data? How useful is it? What can it do? So on and so forth. That culminated, I suppose, in a piece of work in 2014, which was an open letter from the digital pioneers to the digital natives, which was one of Dr. Dracopoulos' sort of primary projects. And here the story was, between those 20 years, from 94 to 2014, the change in the use case of the World Wide Web and the internet was just so radically dramatic that it was impossible for those of us in 94 not to look at it and say, look how much has changed. What we imagine, the stories, let's say, that we told ourselves in the 90s, and there are a number of good conferences that we were running back then, the stories we were telling ourselves about what we would do with this World Wide Web, what would come of it, there was an overwhelming gap, let's say, in where we actually actualized our internet. So we thought it was a good idea to set that sort of two ends of the spectrum. As of course our digital natives, those of whom an internet has always existed, have a very different set of expectations and a very different set of behaviors intertwined with that space. And this particular piece of work led to it being picked up by the Public Democracy Project in the House of Commons. They invited us to speak and present it to them. That led to a number of MPs saying, hey, hang on, I'd never looked at digital rights in that kind of way. This is quite interesting. And next piece, we know we're, as I said, we're writing the Digital Bill of Rights for the Labour Party and a number of other, it was very much a cross-party project at the time. The Labour Party decided to take it on as part of their manifesto and write it. So that's a Cyber Salon backstory, if you like. It's a mix of activists' concerns as the digital transformation of the last 20 years has progressed. There's a continued presence of AI in the form of, literally, I couldn't believe it, Sarah, that you landed on the two issues that we've got as special case stories for. So the Terminator for one, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, at some point. Stephen and I were working on the book project. The Terminator problem was a specific briefing that we gave to all of our contributing writers to exemplify a particular challenge about writing about technology. And it's almost the entire opposite of where you went. So I can't wait for us to get into that. But also, we have the Skynet story. What is it that feeds our supposed futuristic AGI? What is it that it's going to? Well, it's going to be the data that we've captured. It's going to be the stuff, the detritus of our digital lives and behaviors over the last 20 and 30 years, and it just keeps growing. So I guess the main piece of the paper that we presented to Vector and the background to why Cyber Salon's in this discussion with you all today comes here. And that is that part of our outreach yes, we can find those who are activists already in digital rights, and yes, we can find those people who are curious, but how to reach further and to penetrate different spaces to show the relevance and why you want to be engaged in some of these spaces was getting more difficult to us. So we had a mix of online, offline, hybrid events we always have. That's actually Bridget that was zoomed in to I think that was the event in the House of Commons. And Bridget, for those of you who don't know her, was the leader of the Pirate Party in Iceland when they had their wonderful data positive political revolution over there. And there's me talking about a computer game called Riot, which was, again, part of the breadth of what Cyber Salon tries to discuss in terms of media. So we found ourselves in 2021, or at the end of 2020, looking at an explicit speculative fiction project to add to this mix of hybrid events and research workshops. And the nature of the workshop that we ended up coming up with and the selection of the process for that and what it would end up being was really the body of the paper that we've written for submitted to Vector. And so that's a much more practical part. It's the applied part of how can I make use of science fiction for public engagement, for policy development. Is it the case that is it the case that, say, a technologist or an entrepreneur or somebody working in a commerce space thinks in terms of their technology purely in terms of its pocketbook, in terms of its market cap, in terms of its products that it's developing? Or is there a space in which they also need to know the world building around it, the background, the narrative to where that device or that technology or those that end up using it might come from and the impact that it might have? Equally, is it a case that in order to be informing public policy work more fully, that it helps to have done a piece of fictional project, a background in reading of the world that things are living in? So Tales from the Cyber Salon then was a series of 4 events, the first of which was on health, the second of which was on the high street, and then with the fabric of community, so social media and digital money to finish us off at the end of the year. And the workshops followed the same pattern. We would provide an open call for writers as a kickoff, something we couldn't do for the first one, so we had invited writers for the first one, but the pattern throughout the year was an open call for writers. We would then sort of background and brief that, so we would hand in various pieces of Cyber Salon research material, could be the Kinsey report on the digital high street, could be pieces of work that we've done before on digital money, or any of those pieces from YouTube vids to articles that have been written. And we would ask our writers to, imagine that technology in the near future. What tangents, what lines of flight from the current embodied technologies would you like to explore in this conversation? And we'd get, a dozen or 2 dozen stories back a couple of weeks later. Stephen and I would then edit for ones that we thought, these could bring up some interesting issues, or they're exemplifying some interesting lines there. And we would then group those together with an expert panel. So Cyber Salon contributors that we already knew. We would try to put an academic on there, a technologist on there, an entrepreneur on there. So as many of the different opinions as we could get. We would then have a private workshop with the writers. We would tease out some of the more interesting, more troubling, more difficult pieces of the story narrative that they'd proposed. All these stories had to be 1,000 words long. The goal is they had to be read in under 6 minutes on a live event. So 1,000, so quite a strict challenge for a writer to get to. And the private workshop, this is where we ended up with, a couple of things we had to touch on, one of which was the Terminator problem. It's like, are we going to come up with a story that our panelists from their professional careers are going to be comfortable talking about the issue that's being raised by the writer? And we may want to explore that later on in the Q&A. But the goal of the project then, from the open call to the private workshop, helping to tease out some story and discussion ideas, the final goal was a public event where the selected final versions of the stories would be read, a discussion would be had as a panel, and then we would open it up to Q&A. Yeah, that was Tales from the Cyber Salon. And you know, our initial goal of finding a new vehicle to do the job of research and engagement, I think was easily met. We found it a very enjoyable thing to participate in. Incidentally, it was also quite interesting to me to find out how many of the writers thought, wow, having this level of access to, you know, key world builder components like engineers in the field, or, you know, experts in the field to help them flesh out their stories was very beneficial. But then also, you know, here's the book plug, which I suppose we're in here for. The final collection then, which we've gathered to publish, a really interesting comment that I think we all agreed with here from Douglas Rushkoff, who offered us an introduction that I'd like to read. And he says that, you know, he's become aware that no matter how well I argue, I'm painfully limited in my ability to reach through to people who don't already see the world as I do. My facts and insights don't penetrate closed minds. It's as if my premises just bounce off people's skulls and scatter on the ground unconsidered. If only I could get people to create a sliver of an opening to suppose something new or different, even if just for a moment. If they could only consider the utterly implausible, even just for kicks, I know I could take care of the rest. And I think that exemplifies the goal that Cyber Salon had here. It's like, we would be the utterly implausible for kicks, but we would try and anchor that in as certain a set of possible technologies, as real a set of development goals that industry and politics at large might have, to both enable the writers and hopefully elicit a informed discussion. And that's basically what I hope I'm able to bring today. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Ben. It's quite a lot there for people to sort of dig into and ask you about, and for us to discuss.
Apologies if I overran. I couldn't see any other comments whilst I was in the slides.
It's all right, you did overrun a little bit, but that's fine. That's fine. We can, as I say, there's all that stuff sitting alongside Sarah's stuff, I think, starts to get us in a space where it's kind of quite an interesting dynamic going on there. I'm going to now do my piece, just really unpacking a little bit, as I said at the beginning, why this was interesting to me, and then we'll get into the discussion and questions and stuff. So I'll just see. So I have the unenviable position of not having somebody to introduce me. So let's see if Ben or Sarah, you could tell me whether I'm successful in my sharing. What is it that you can see?
We're getting all of your app, but your slides. So start there.
So that doesn't work. Is that any better?
That's it.
Oh, that was it, was it? Ah.
Oh, you've
Okay.
gone. No, it's disappeared.
Okay.
Stephen, you've stopped sharing. Oh, you're coming back.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. Right. Sorry, I'm struggling here with two screens and using OpenOffice's version of PowerPoint, which I have to say is not the best of the OpenOffice suite. But anyhow, we're here. So, I mean, this is a little bit about me in the kind of absence of an introduction. But the thing I particularly wanted to sort of focus in on, in terms of just contextualizing me, so to speak, is really those middle two. So we've already talked about the last one, about this issue of vector. Just to sort of explain really a little bit about what me working with scientists and technologists to explore possible futures through short stories. Obviously, as Ben's mentioned, one of those projects was with Cyber Salon. Another example is sort of coming towards its end after about 12 months is a project I'm working on with King's College London, where the project itself is piloting the development of an automated approach to coding expressed emotion in mother's speech to improve prediction of youth mental health problems. That's quite a big phrase. Basically, can we train or can we produce machine learning, a trained AI, let's call it for the sake of argument, to be able to listen to mothers talking about their children and from that those children's future mental health. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating project, mix of AI people plus clinical psychologists. And just to give you a sense of how those things work, so I've spent time with both the AI people and the clinical psychologists. We've had some workshops with young people and with psychologists. And at the end of that, my job is to write a couple of short pieces of near future fiction that help unearth the ethical issues around this project, not coming down on any particular side necessarily, but to give those sort of thought pieces. And then in a couple of weeks' time, I think it is 23rd of June, Conway Hall, I'll be reading those. There'll be a panel and we'll have audience Q&A where we kind of start to unpack what's in those. What are people getting from those? What do they think about them and all the rest of it? That's an example of what I mean by those projects. The other thing, the second piece there, just to unpack that slightly. So there is an LA-based company called SciFutures who are taking this from the website. They accelerate innovation with sci-fi prototyping, helping companies rehearse the future because stories are data with soul. My job in there is I get a brief from them, and again I write a short piece which they put together. I'm not the only one that writes one. They put that together in an anthology of pieces, which then begins that sort of conversation with whichever company it is they're working with. I think if you look at their client list, they're fairly big international companies quite often. So that's just, they're the kind of things that I thought was interesting in terms of what I do that sort of fit with this particular thing. So hopefully that is, no, that didn't work. So let's use a mouse. Okay, you should now have the second slide. So I think we're probably, well, we'll see from the Q&A and the discussion, but stories are important. It's fairly uncontroversial comment. One of the, so it's from a draft submission to the Vector piece from Dr. Danby Kim, who's a neuroscientist and big into solar punk. And there's lots of references to back this statement up that I haven't put up here. Stories profoundly improve our abilities to remember and pass on complex information, gain perspective on difficult situations, and expand our capacity for empathy. So that's just a sort of a little bit of sort of situating what stories can do. And as I was thinking about the stories, I was thinking around them having a life cycle to an extent. So world building. And by that, I don't necessarily mean in the actual story, but what's the context that this story is in? There's thought that has to go into that. What's the world it's in? Even if that's not explicit in the story, it's something that's thought about before creating a story. What's the actual narrative, plot, characters? How do people interact with technology, all that sort of thing? Then there's the story being heard, and I think Sarah, I think you used the word imbibe, which I really like. So, you know, are they heard? Are they seen? Are they read? Whatever that is, imbibed. Obviously, there's a level of interpretation then, either by the imbiber or by somebody interpreting it on behalf of others. And finally, the being passed on, the retelling of it. And I have to say, some of that last stuff came from reading a couple of your pieces there. So thank you for that. But I think there's different moments in the life of a story where they can be influenced, and they can influence the people active in each of those elements. And that's what I was trying to get at there. I'm not going to hover too much on the definitions. I've put some definitions there from Wikipedia. I don't want to get hooked up on the definitions here, and I think this is a broader conversation probably than definition. The only thing I want to pick up, which I would be interesting to hear from Sarah and Ben and others, is the final thing there on near future fiction. So, having said that it's described what it is, it then goes on to say such fiction is too frightening to be popular, and I'm not sure I agree with that. I think there's an awful lot of popular near future quite frightening stuff that is still popular. You know, Black Mirror probably is a really good example of something that's very popular. Anyhow, that's something we might want to hover over. And then, so this is now getting into the meat of what I was pondering as I was putting this together. So, you know, I'm wondering, as a writer, what is my responsibility to the future and to the current in terms of what I write, how I go about writing it, and all the rest of it. And in order to answer that, I felt I needed to, you know, does speculative fiction influence scientists, technologies, etc., etc.? Because if it doesn't, then I can write what I want. Does its predictions affect the future? Again, that's important to know as to whether I have any responsibility. If it does it have a responsibility to be accurate and not sensational? Bearing in mind, you know, Terminator is a classic that's picked up, particularly the film, you know, that's quite sensational, not necessarily that accurate. Does it have to inspire and not demoralize? Should it be more utopian than dystopian? Or actually, is it really just there for entertainment? And we all know it's entertaining and we don't need to worry about it at all. And I think there is a real dilemma for a writer around entertaining and engaging people's imaginations without causing ripples that create futures that we absolutely don't want. I'm not saying it's an insurmountable thing, but I think it is a bit of a dilemma. I was then looking at a Nesta paper, and which is referenced at the bottom of this, and looking at the different. So this sort of sits alongside the arc of the story, and just sort of thinking, okay, so there's different moments where there's influence. There's also different ways of influencing, and they come up with these five ways. And I won't read them out, but they're kind of like, you invent something in a story, somebody then absolutely replicates that in real life. Whether it's true or not, Star Trek with its communicator and a mobile phone. I don't know if that's true, but that would be an example. So how do you frame it? How do you inspire some innovation? Who actually is influencing and being influenced? Are there particular gatekeepers around that? And then the wider thing about being understood by the one wider public, the specialist areas, and how they're debated and judged. And I think that's kind of an interesting, towards the bottom of that is kind of interesting for this discussion, but some of the other is relevant too. So having sort of thought all through that, I think there's two things we need to really consider, and I think it's fairly obvious, but it's worth saying, and I'm going to flip these around. So who has the privilege to be able to think about the future? And it's something we've had to think a lot about in the projects I've been involved in. And I don't think we've cracked it, to be honest. I don't think it's really difficult to get people who have two jobs, a large family, or there's various people who basically are thinking about the now and don't have that privilege. And I think that's important to think about in terms of the arc of the story and who gets to influence it when. And that's really the same as the second point, who has access to actually influence these things. So cutting to the chase, what's the answers to I'm now answering my own questions, and I'd be really interested to hear from the audience and from Sarah and Ben whether you agree with these answers or not, because I think they're work in progress answers, so I'm not fixated, I'm not fixed on them. But does it have an influence? I think from everything I've read and heard, Yes. Does it do its predictions affect the future? I think the answer is yes, if you take predictions and effect in their broadest sense. And I think it was quite an interesting, so moving away from the I invented a Star Trek communicator and we got the mobile phone, to a much bigger sort of social and framing kind of thing. Therefore, does it have responsibility to be accurate and not sensational? I think it does to an extent. There is a danger you lose the attractiveness of the story, and if you do that, I think you then lose its ability to influence. So there is that tension, and I nicked Ben's phrase, beyond the plausible and the possible there. Should it inspire, not demoralize? That's kind of utopia, dystopia. I think if you're trying to inspire and trying to have influence, then it needs to generate some action, although that might be really subtle shifts of understanding and behavior. Or is it simply there for entertainment? Well, primarily, but thinking about things can be quite entertaining too. So it's not a kind of one or the other. And then finally, and I'm just using my own kind of phrases that I use a lot in terms of what do I want to do. There's a Frederick Pohl quote around sci-fi should predict the traffic jam, not the automobile. That's the kind of summarized of the quote, which I think is great. But actually, I think there's a bigger question: is the automobile worth the traffic jam? So it's not just about predicting; it's about having those conversations. And there's various stories I've got that touch on that, and an article in the BSFA Focus about Stop the Dystopia I want to get on, but I'll stop there. That's kind of in some ways me asking questions of myself and answering them, but that's really just a way of opening my thinking up to this panel and this audience. So thank you. There we are. Frankenstein is still quite popular.
And scary as hell, right? I mean,
and scary, and I think and retold in various ways. I think the kind of premise of creating something that's then kind of out of control or out of your control. So shall we start with some questions from the audience there? And Ben, are you okay that we've got a couple? We might as well we've got a few coming in. We might as well throw it open rather than us immediately having our discussion. So I think there was one in the chat for Ben from MS. So let's pick up that first.
Yeah, I did see it.
Have you seen that? What about the potential, in addition to stories, of poetry, visual art, performance, etc., to bring people in?
I think it's a very good question. I mean, a caveat I'd put to it really is, it wasn't quite as clinical as just bringing people in, like putting bums on seats and selling tickets. The in that we were trying to accomplish with the Tales from Cyber Salon project was participation in policy formation. So I think whichever media or whichever type of performance art that you might choose, I think the challenge is not that the form of the art isn't suitable for it. I think the challenge is that you want to find a way that it can help direct policy debate and participation in policy debate. And I think the reason we ended up with a story first and foremost is because we had Stephen's expertise with stories and we had some familiarity with it. We've done similar projects, as I say, with computer games and computer gaming narrative, partly because the Middlesex University has been using computer games as part of the digital BA. So again, familiarity with the medium allows us to ask the harder question, which is, how do I use this medium to get people involved in policy formation and debate? But absolutely, there's plenty of policy and public policy and debate in ballet, in painting, and in pose for sure. So yeah,
I
that's
guess it's I guess it's kind of whatever can help people step outside of their sort of practical, pragmatic, day-to-day framing of things is good, isn't it? Sarah, I was wondering if you
Yeah, so we in some separate work have used a tabletop collaborative storytelling game to imagine different futures of autonomous flight. So I think, and this is always my answer to most questions, is it's both and. It's not that focusing on stories excludes other media, it's that you can do that and other things. There's a self-containment to stories in some ways, and less resource needed, which sometimes makes it easier for smaller and practical exercises. And stories have been incorporated into a variety of narrative futures methods for as long as future studies has existed. So that would be thinking about that. There's also Shahar Avin, who's at CSER, which is the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge, has designed a really interesting sort of role play game, which I've taken part in, which is a very verging on drama, kind of collaborative drama, a really interesting way of imagining different futures. So there's the field is ripe for lots of different methods. It doesn't have to focus on just one.
Yeah, there's a project I was involved in called Utopia Now in sort of Southwark and Lambeth with young people, and they definitely had theatre. I think they had other things as well as the stories that we did. Anna Maria, I don't know who was next, but hey.
Yeah, thanks so much for your fascinating and really inspiring presentations. I'm Anna. I work at, I'm an STS Science and Technology Studies Scholar, and I have been working in science, public engagement with science quite a lot in relation to emerging technologies. And doing that work, we have been once using science fiction in a new starting project. Now I'm going to use it again. And the reason why we've been using it before is because we're trying to capture what we call in STS like social technical imaginaries of emerging technologies. And so that's not easy, especially when those technologies are so new that there is still not, like a clear kind of public opinion or a clear kind of public positioning. An example of this, for instance, there has been a lot of, talk in Europe about genetically modified plants, but now there is a lot of scientific work on genetically modified microorganisms and not really any public talk about it. So we've been using science fiction also before for nanotechnology and other things, because like what we would like to have is to capture those imaginaries in a way, in a moment that is previous than when, like people have been, maybe the issue has been out for so long that maybe has been too much dominated by scientific talk or by policy kind of frameworks. So as a way of like avoiding that framing from scientists and authorities and trying to get to a more open kind of moment, we'll be looking at using science fiction. We do that because science fiction is always also more kind of both concrete. Those stories are both concrete but also indeterminate, because they're more kind of ambiguous, and it gives you an opening because there is like some of them, like they are obviously like dystopia or utopia, but many are just like combining elements, dystopic and utopic elements, and that kind of opening is really interesting for kind of like using in a trigger like further public debate on emerging technologies. So I'm just like telling all of this to ask you, like, so how do you think about the potentials of science fiction for getting like people to talk about emerging technologies, which problems we cannot still, like see clearly. Yeah. So just a comment on that, maybe.
I've got one comment, and then I'm sure the others have as well. So I did a project in Finsbury Park a couple of years ago where I wrote a story having spent a day with people, and part of that had sort of bioengineered plants, but also bioengineered humans and all the rest of it. What was really interesting is when later we did a public event and read the stories to an audience and had some prepared questions to sort of ask them their views on some of this, partly which character we want to be, but what, are you pro this or against it and all the rest of it. But what was really interesting was then once people had indicated and we'd ask them why, we were then asking people if they changed their mind, and there were people who were changing their minds and able to say why as a result of the conversation that was coming out of the stories and then the things that were following. So it kind of gave quite a good platform to have that and to see that going on, and it was a relatively small audience, so it may have been better or may worked because it was a small audience. So Sarah, do you have
there's loads of examples of this happening. One of the reasons for writing the book was to provide a rigorous theoretical underpinning for why all of this is sort of legitimate and has value. But there's lots of articles on using science fiction in teaching within universities, in teaching ethics around emerging technologies. There are, as Stephen said, practical examples of using science fiction in science communication. In the What AI Researchers Read paper that Stephen mentioned at the beginning, which is out any day, there's a section on science fiction and science communication and how researchers themselves think about it as both an obstacle to communication in some ways because of misleading narratives, but also as a shared point of departure for discussing issues around AI and other technologies. And then I think the emerging area where I'd like to see it done more is in the increasing importance of public deliberation, which there's a strong case for now in relation to climate change, for instance, but we've had these kinds of public deliberative civic sort of councils in Ireland around the abortion debate, and they're shown to be quite effective ways to get publics, non-expert publics, to engage in really interesting ways with really important wicked problems and policy debates. And I think it's not clear to me that science fiction is being used in those contexts as much as it could be, and that's where I'd like to see it being used more. I think there's a point to make, and I guess this was a question to Ben, is there's a strong, as I said, history and future studies of using stories in incasting and backcasting and future mapping, and using narrative and creating new stories, as in science fiction prototyping, but there is less use of an engagement with existing science fiction stories. And there's a strong case that body of science fiction work that already exists is a resource and a data set that hasn't yet been used, which might preclude needing to write more. Like, maybe we need to actually look at the ones we've already got better. So I think in sort of public democratic environments, yes, you can use storytelling to create new stories. We did that with the autonomous flight exercise, where the participants created their new story. But there's also an argument to say, right, take Asimov or take a film and put it in that setting and engage with it in a more detailed way than you would just maybe having walked out the cinema, and see how those stories are effective as well. And again, it can be both and.
Yeah, no, absolutely, both and works perfectly fine there. Yeah, there's a limit to my sort of scope for conversation here, really, not just to the Tales project, but there is a very practical piece there. It was a workshop that we ran and we took a year over it. We worked out, how we were going to do it, and we had a very specific goal in mind. Prior to my career in engineering, I was doing mathematics and philosophy at Warwick, which is your university as well. Very strong use of Gibson sci-fi and Neil Stephenson sci-fi when discussing the politics and the economics of what was about to happen in digital transformation. So yeah, I think you've got a good case. There is a body of sci-fi literature out there that could be applied to discussing contemporary issues. And the challenge then is, you know, on the one hand, finding it if you don't already know it, and on the second hand, having your public informed of it and engaged with it. Both and. One of the things about a brand new story that starts from scratch is that you remove that sort of required background knowledge. So if what you're running on the day, it could be a book club, it could be a reflection event, or it could be a workshop from scratch. The workshop from scratch, obviously, you end up with a tangible output of telling a new story, even if there's no such thing as a new story. It's just an old story told differently. Maybe that's what we end up doing with these kind of things. I don't know. But I would encourage you, Anna, to try it. I mean, I think we're giving you the confidence to try it, the examples to try it and do it.
I might get in touch with some of your concrete methods later on. Thanks so much. It was great.
You're welcome. Ezra, I think you were next, and then Ian.
Thanks, Stephen. This is so massively consumed me for decades, all these subjects, that I'm a bit overwhelmed and not quite sure where to start. But one thing I can definitively say is that Martin Cooper, the engineer who developed the original mobile phone, has confirmed that he was inspired by watching Star Trek to do so. So it's definitely true. And there are other examples. Robert Goddard, the physicist who developed the liquid fuel that rockets use to get off the surface of the planet, was inspired to do that by reading H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds as a child, and being so scared that he thought the only thing that would save Earth would be if we could get up there and attack Mars first. And that led him to go into physics and into science and develop that fuel. But there are other examples that are not well known and much more difficult to deal with. And Stephen, you may have heard me talk about John Sladek before. Particularly his short story from 1972, The Great Wall of Mexico, in which he posited a man with no political experience elected as president of the United States, largely on the back of a promise to build a wall along the Mexican border to keep out the drug dealers and the illegal immigrants. It's a kind of social prophecy that science fiction at its best, or speculative fiction, really we should call it, is so capable of. But what worries me now, and this touches on things that both Sarah and Ben said, is the co-option of the science fiction imagination to corporate ends. And I'm beginning to realize that some of the things that I've been doing recently are not as perhaps wholesome as I thought they were, by persuading business leaders to, as sci-futures call it, rehearse the future and use science fiction as a means of doing that is actually deeply problematic. And just to illustrate that, Terminator, I think, makes the point for us brilliantly, because, of course, James Cameron made the film Terminator and got promptly sued by Harlan Ellison because he stole the basic idea from 2 episodes of The Outer Limits that had been written by Harlan Ellison. Now, Harlan Ellison as a writer is, I think, one of the most significant in speculative fiction, but he's hardly known beyond, nerds like me. If you take a story like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, it's way too dangerous and difficult to be used, really, I think, in any of the sort of settings we're discussing. And I think that relates to the point, Stephen, you were making about, what's your duty as a writer. I think the problem is that there are fundamentally different moral duties for artists and for public policymakers. I think there's a serious danger, and just, Ben, I lived that history. I was at the University of Westminster in 1997 when that launch happened. And if you compare Cyber Salon with CogX, I think you'll see where I'm going. If you look at this year's CogX program, it starts on Monday, and I will be there as well. You see, it's actually quite frightening. All the alternative voices, all the sort of challenging voices have been really airbrushed out. In the same way that in the history of science fiction, people like Harlan Ellison, Joanna Russ, Samuel Delaney, they've kind of been airbrushed out. And Harlan Ellison, by the way, wrote the original screenplay for I, Robot, which was authorized by Isaac Asimov, who, of course, didn't live to see the Will Smith movie vehicle. And it's a completely different story, much more focused on Susan Calvin. And the questions that, if anybody attended Kathleen Richardson's panel yesterday that were being discussed around whether algorithms are misogynistic, or in fact whether misogyny is an algorithm. So yeah, I think that's a bit of a ramble, but there are a lot of really problematic issues as well as a lot of potential in these things, and I'd love to hear your views on that, all of those points, if that's not too challenging.
I also will be at CogX. I'm chairing the opening plenary on Tuesday, and I think they'd be horrified actually to hear you say that. I do think it needs to be said. I think there's a narrative around the corporate that's prevalent, particularly in humanities academia, an important one of critique, but it sometimes precludes engagement. And I think, I will tell the CogX people that I know on Tuesday that there is a sense that has been airbrushed out, and I think they're perhaps more open than sometimes that narrative imagines, and that they would want to know that and would want to rectify that. So it's a slightly different perspective on that narrative. I'm really curious, what was the story I'm a huge fan of Ellison as well, and we write about the soldier in the book, which is a fantastic story, not least because it's a narrative model of the influence of stories in governance itself. So it's a wonderfully recursive narrative model in that sense. But which was the Ellison story that you said you thought was too dangerous to use, and why would that be the case?
It's called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. And it imagines the last handful of human beings trapped in a world created by the super AI computers that have taken over. And he depicts graphically the senseless and horrific violence that the computer inflicts on them, and the consequences for their sense of humanity as they all, one by one, meet a grisly end. And it's challenging. It's really challenging. But I think he's saying something extremely important. And as
but
I
that
say,
would be no, sorry.
It wouldn't get made into a movie for the same reason that his iRobot screenplay didn't get made. As he put it, not enough explosions, not enough, not enough love interest. Susan Calvin in the Will Smith vehicle was just a love interest, and whereas in Asimov's stories and in Ellison's screenplay, it was a very different take on her role.
Well, maybe we should propose a panel on I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream at CogX next year.
That would be extremely interesting. I'd love to be part of that.
You heard it here first, folks.
I got a couple of things that all of that as I want to bounce off of, actually. I'll start with the Have No Mouth, I Must Scream, the example of something that's too rough to deal with, and pick up on something, Stephen, that you said in your slides, which was around, the role of the writer, because I mean, we kind of teased that out, Esri, when you were saying, the role of the writer versus the role of the public policy development group, and that those aren't necessarily the same thing. When we were...
Well, sorry, Ben, just to be clear, I said the ethics or the moral duty.
Right. Okay,
those
so the moral duty
are very different.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, the comment I was going to make was, as we were sort of putting together the typeset final version of 22 ideas, Wendy Grossman, who's another contributor to Cyber Salon, she actually commented, says like, well, does it stand up as a piece of fiction, this? We know we set out with that to make a piece of public policy engagement. And then we're sitting there saying, okay, who do we want to do the puff pieces? Who do we want to do the reviews? Is it in the sci-fi? And he's like, I'm not sure it stands up as that. So, she's very well-grounded lady. It just struck me as there are those clear differences. When it comes back to the roles and the responsibility of the author there then still, or the ethical purpose of the author, at the very least, I want to unpick the it's too horrifying or the, inspire versus horrify. Because I mean, I've read plenty of horrifying texts and horrifying content that has been inspirational to me, if not to just get up and change it, right? I don't think anybody read 1984 in that kind of like, oh, this is a guide to how to run the future. And I don't think anybody who was inspired to change the future that read 1984 did so in a sense of like, distress and horror, although it is a horrifying text. I think the other piece I wanted to say was, I just stuck some notes and say, I had to make this at some point, but the fiction manipulating the real world, or using fiction and setting up the moral boundaries in fiction to contribute to the real world, it isn't one way either. It's very definitely, you know, a Mobius strip that the world that you've created allows you to tell certain truths and stories. So when we're talking about how that story is told, a classic example of that is actually the Star Trek transporter. So, you know, that is conceded as rich as, like, the transporter only exists in Star Trek because nobody in the film crew wants to build the models and can afford to do the landing of ships from orbit to the ground. So it is entirely a conceit of the real practical world of storytelling that invention in the world exists in the first place. So, you know, there's a lot of play between what the real world can tell and what the fiction what is required then in the fiction. So, you know, if you are a public policy group and you want to have certain discussions made, then you're right. Your ethical compass, if you like, is pointing towards setting up that story in that kind of way, as opposed to perhaps the writer's one, which is like, okay, what do I want to do? I think I don't even have that answer. What do I want to do with my story?
Okay, brilliant. I've got some thoughts, but I'm conscious that Ian's been very patiently there with his hand up. So, Ian, do you want to come on?
Hi there, can you hear me? Great. Yeah, thanks for the panel and everything. I only had a kind of a brief question, really. But I just want to point out first that there's not a movie version, but there is a computer game version of I Have No Mouth, but I Must Scream, which came out in the 90s and has some narration by the author as well in it. It's kind of got a bit of a cult reputation.
Story, Ian? Does it have the same title as the story?
Yeah, it's the same. And I think it loosely follows the plot of the book in that it's like a point and click adventure game, and you play each of the characters going through their kind of grim stories, I suppose. But yeah, you can look on YouTube, there's playthroughs of it and that sort of thing. But yeah, my question was, I mean, my fieldwork, my PhD is in the nuclear industry, and the nuclear industry often is telling or coming up with stories, workshopping them and things like that, but much further off, you know, especially when it comes to nuclear disposal and things like that. When you're building a disposal facility for nuclear materials, you're talking about what will the future be like in 1 million years. You know, how can we build something that will be resistant to that in a long time? There's films like Into Eternity to talk about the kind of weird ideas about that. So it's a very different scale of time compared to these near future things. So I was wondering about, because I'm more experienced with the extra long, deep time approach, but when you, you know, where do you draw the line in terms of, you know, what's plausible, how far ahead you should go, what kind of futures you should be thinking of? You know, is it something that's sort of a step away, a decade away or two, you know, or how far ahead do you feel you can discuss with any kind of confidence, you know? And if you're only looking at you know, a decade or two ahead, you know, something that's plausible, is there maybe a risk of short-termism a little bit there, because technology is always developing, and you know, you can look at issues that might be there in 20 years that might be solved in 30 years, or vice versa, something may become more problematic further down the line, you know? You know, how do you work through that in terms of trying to imagine futures?
Very quickly, for me, not to dismiss the idea of the grand space opera set 50,000 years in the future. That wouldn't be the piece that I was sort of going after. I start from the premise that the future is the present. You know, those things that are going to impact and happen tomorrow are already happening now. It's the, you know, arriving at different speeds kind of story, if you like. So embedded in the current present set of inequalities and challenges are either the technological needs or the motives for the industry to produce in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So I've got it's no line is drawn, but the starting position for that line is right now. So looking at what's here right now and using that to start telling stories is where I come from.
I think from my point of view, I think my answer to your question would be, it depends on your audience. So in the work we did with Cybercell, and as Ben's kind of saying, the premise was very much how these are people that are building the immediate future for us. So it was very much about the immediate future. I don't think this kind of thing precludes the long future. It's in some ways it's probably both more difficult and easier from a writer's point of view. Like the near future is quite difficult because you're proved wrong possibly even before you're published, although only on some of the real techie stuff, not necessarily on how this plays out in society and all the rest of it, because obviously there's been says that's about kind of now, whereas in the longer term it's less predictable, maybe, or it's certainly not going to happen before you're published. But I don't think it's necessarily precluded. It's just a very different sort of thing. And again, I'm stumbling a bit, so I'm going to hand on to Sarah. But coming back to my first point, which is I think it's possible. It just depends on the audience and what you're kind of doing, and maybe some of the, as Sarah was saying, some of the stuff that already exists gives you that way into that. But Sarah, I'm sure you'll be far more articulate than I would.
No, not lots of thoughts. I think I have to be really careful, and this I've written about this recently in answer to some questions I got from a journalist. Really careful about assuming that you know, if the world of the fiction is closer temporally to your own, then in some way it's closer technically to or socio-technically to our own. It's just it's not the case. And to give a kind of an example in relation to climate change rather than AI, something like N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, which is fantasy really, although it's got science fiction embedded in it and some of its specific narrative strands, is a hugely important contemporary narrative model for thinking about how you live with recurrent risk and how you conceptualize environmental change at scales beyond that of the single human life. But it's not in any way a near or far future, you know, science fiction text. So it would come back to one of my kind of key points, which is it's how we read these things and how we understand how they're functioning and what they're modeling that releases their different types of cognitive value, rather than saying, if I want to be more relevant to now, I have to write something that's closer to now. You could write the weirdest, bizarrest, horrific, imaginative story, and it could still have some really useful cognitive value in relation to something that's happening now. So that's a kind of I guess a kind of plea for not constraining the kind of fiction that we engage with or that we produce. And it speaks to Stephen's question about, you know, what kind of fiction should I write? There is a kind of move to saying, you know, for instance, that apocalyptic stories about climate change haven't mobilized social action, therefore we need more utopian ones. And you get that kind of narrative coming out of the Center for Science and Imagination at Arizona, and they've produced like Hieroglyph, which is a collection of utopian stories for a better future. They're not mobilizing change any more than the apocalyptic ones are. So for me, it's not necessarily about whether it's a utopian story or a dystopian story or a horror or it's a fantasy. It's how good a story is it, how much affect does it have, and how much cognitive value does it have. And I guess that's a very kind of scholarly view, but I think it's a really important one to locate ourselves in, because I would be really horrified if people stopped writing horror or stopped writing dystopia, or, you know, and only tried to focus on utopian imaginings, which we know from the history of the utopian genre actually produces fairly dull narrative most of the time. If anyone's actually managed to wade through the original utopia, I give them huge credit. The other thing to point you to, and this links to Ben's point about what the future is, you know, of course, the future doesn't exist anywhere other than in our imaginations, ever. And Riel Miller, who was until very recently the head of futures at UNESCO, has done some really important and useful work on what he calls developing futures literacy, and are simply understanding what the future is better. So that would be something you all might be interested in. And he talks about needing to think about our anticipatory assumptions, which are the assumptions and the views that are embedded in our present perspectives, which determine our imagining of the future. And actually, it's not about controlling the future. It's about being really self-conscious about our anticipatory assumptions, which determine action in the present, which then lead to the futures that the future that we end up inhabiting. And the last plea for space opera, because I think this might be what my next academic book is going to be on, and to bring us back to AI, Ian M. Banks's culture novels remain for me one of the most significant extended imaginings of human-machine interaction at a societal and governance level. I think he was way ahead of his time in those novels. It's so sad that we lost him when we did, and he, you know, he has reinvented that genre in a way that, whether consciously or not, and I've never asked, as someone like Becky Chambers has inherited, something like Nadia Korafor, who's writing kind of Afrofuturist space, fantasy space opera, all part of a new reinvigoration of that genre, which I think is crucial to our contemporary thinking about climate change and about AI.
So we're close to closing. I can see Ezra's got his hand up. There was one thing just before I come back to you, Ezra, and we kind of wrap up. There's a question I had, possibly for Sarah and Ben, but maybe others, which is there, and it's coming back to the AI thing, is there something about AI that's different to other kind of technologies or issues and all the rest of it? And I kind of wondering, because, you know, AI tends to get a bit you know, embodied and all the rest of it. I don't know whether it has a difference to anything and everything else or not. Is that?
I would say no. And I think actually AI's claim to exceptionality is part of the problems with the narratives we have around AI at the moment. I ran for most of 2020 and 21 a massive Mellon Sawyer seminar on the history of AI, precisely historicizing it within many, many different historical developments. And more people are writing about it now as a general purpose technology, which can be linked to something like electricity. So yes, it might be having ubiquitous effects, but we've had technologies that have done that before. I mean, ironically enough, Ezra, it was at CogX last year that I talked about AI as a kind of Leotardian grand narrative, and that we have to be, you know, suspicious of that grand narrative and break it down, not just into the different types of technologies that actually get pulled in under that umbrella, but to analyze the rhetoric around the idea of AI itself and what political work that's doing. That would be my short answer.
Excellent.
I think very much it's an access to the future kind of story. You know, by setting stories about AI as being the predominant ones that are going to matter in the future, you're basically saying to everybody, and look, if you're not involved in AI, you aren't involved in the future. I'm sorry, you have to, you know, presupposes that sort of involvement. Where, you know, 100 years ago it might have been, well, you take the Frankenstein story, you know, then it's like the future of electricity, it will change everything, and there's classic history examples of that all the way back. I think AI is nothing different in that respect.
Wireless.
There isn't actually any electricity in Frankenstein. I just read a fantastic PhD from a scholar in New Zealand, which shows that Frankenstein, our memory of Frankenstein is entirely distorted by the cinematic version. And if you go back to it, the body is actually grown rather than inspired with life. So it would be another encouragement to go back and read the original story.
Well, it makes a perfect case for the fact that these stories live past their immediate.
And change through their adaptations and live on through the often cinematic versions, which can have a more popular sway than the original literary texts. I
am
brilliant. So we're almost there. You've got a kind of 20-second slot here, Ezra, before we
oh gosh, okay. Just very quickly on that Frankenstein point, same is absolutely true of Karol Čapek's RUR, because his original artificial beings were grown. They weren't mechanical, you know, they weren't machines that were manufactured. But
it was the first adaptation that then put them as kind of they realized on stage that it wouldn't work if the robots looked like the human beings, because you wouldn't know which was which. So they made them kind of all which goes back to Ben's point about the Star Trek transporter. It was a
what in Hollywood they call a MacGuffin. It was just a MacGuffin to get the story across. But I actually wanted to come back to the point you made, Sarah, about how much affect a story has and what the consequences are for its influence. Because earlier on in your presentation, you showed that classic image of the Terminator, which is that skull with teeth, and actually made me think, I hadn't noticed before how much it conveys Mark Fisher's definitions of the weird and the eerie, another writer we lost far too soon. But for Mark Fisher said the weird is the presence of something that shouldn't be there. So the teeth in the Terminator absolutely shouldn't be there. And the eerie is something that should be there, but isn't. So in the Terminator's case, no skin. It's, you know, it's a skull, it's a ostensibly human body. So I think what happens there is that those elements in it, that's what makes it clickbait. That's what appeals to us, is the urge to sort of deal with this difficulty of something being both weird and eerie. And I think for another time, that's something that structural anthropologists may well want to look at, in the underlying elements that make a story's affect sufficient to generate the kind of response that you're looking for.
Yeah, but of course, there's no way of
irony as well. I think the challenge of irony. So if we're talking about which stories we create, so I mean, I'm sitting here with thoughts of Neil Stephenson's books on the metaverse, and a particular American entrepreneur's lack of particular reading on it. The whole Facebook metaverse and the metaverse of Stevenson seem to be at odds with each other. So yeah, be careful what you write, writers.
But there's no way, if I may, just before we finish, there's no way of predicting whether the weird and the eerie is going to draw people in or repel them. So it's caused a sticky affect with the Terminator. And this is an odd reference to be ending on, but Ugly Sonic. Do you remember when they released the first image of Sonic and it had human teeth and human proportions, and the internet just went mad and was like, no, this is horrendous, and they had to redesign Sonic. So there's also, and this is what I love about it, the kind of unpredictability of stories. You don't know which weird eerie ones are going to work and which weird eerie ones are going to, by fan demand, absolutely disappear.
Brilliant, thank you, and thank you everybody. So I think that's a really good thing to end on. Actually,
with Ugly Sonic.
I feel less responsible because you don't really know what's going to land and what isn't.
Stephen, do you want me to say something about the recording? Because we were asked at the beginning about the recordings being made public. And
I saw you put something in the chat. Yeah,
I checked the RAI's policy, which says that recordings may be made available beyond those who attended the conference at a future date, and that is on the conference website. So, however, there is a remedy. If you do not want to be included, you can contact the RAI and they will edit you out of the video. So it can be available more widely, but you can get taken out if you want to.
Okay, thanks, Ezra. It's good to clarify that for people. Okay, so brilliant. Thank you to everyone who turned up, everyone who came. Absolutely, thank you to Sarah and Ben, and to those of you who kind of asked questions, and also those who put stuff in the chat. Absolutely brilliant. Feels like we could probably go on for another couple of hours, and were this a real live event, we would probably now be propping up a coffee bar at this time of day, maybe, who knows, but this wouldn't be the end of it. So I didn't think we'd manage to fill the time, but we've more than easily filled the time. So thank you, everybody. And I think that's wrapping it up, which I'm very glad.
Thanks for organising, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Indeed. Good talking with you.
Okay.